Welcome. My name is Karen Greenberg. I am the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to start talking about Audrey Cronin's book, Power to the People: How Open Technological Innovation is Arming Tomorrow's Terrorists. This event will be rebroadcast on C-SPAN and will be available on our website. Today's discussion will focus on some of the contours of today's terrorism, both in terms of the new directions taken in the procurement and use of 21st century weaponry, from AI to smartphones to more sophisticated uses and distribution of older weapons, including nuclear weapons. Our aim is to look at what changes have occurred, what countermeasures have been adopted, and what vulnerabilities and threats still need to be addressed, and in what ways. All of this against the backdrop of both continuing and new developments in terrorist strategies and the ability to procure these new technologies. So we have a big task ahead of us in this next hour, but we have just the panel to do this. Our distinguished panel today includes author of the book, Audrey Kurth Cronin, a professor and the founding director at the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology at American University. From 2007 to 2011, Dr. Cronin was a faculty member and director of the core course on war and statecraft at the U.S. National War College. Her prior books include How Terrorism Ends: Understanding the Decline and Demise of Terrorist Organizations. Brian Jenkins, who will hopefully be joining us in a few minutes, is the senior advisor to the president of the RAND Corporation. He is the author of numerous books, reports, and articles on terrorism-related topics, including recently with Paul Gauge's The Long Shadow of 9/11, America's Response to Terrorism. His recent pieces have looked at domestic terrorism, and he's been published widely and spoken in Congress recently on this topic. Clint Watts is with us as well. Clint Watts is a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a non-resident fellow at Alliance for Securing Democracy. He is a national security contributor for NBC News and MSNBC. He was formerly a special agent at the FBI, where he served on a joint terrorism task force. He is the author of numerous articles and reports on national security, and is the author of Messing with the Enemy: Surviving in a Social Media World of Hackers, Terrorists, Russians, and Fake News. Technology, as Audrey Kurth Cronin reminds us, has been used for centuries as a means of what she calls, and I love this phrase, wreaking havoc in communities, societies, and at the international level. The questions that face us today are: what is the current and foreseeable state of technology that can be weaponized, not just by nations and groups, but also, and increasingly, by individuals, a growing concern among counterterrorism experts. So to start off today, Audrey's going to sort of tell us the landscape. She's going to use, as I understand it, some slides. And so we'll reconvene after the slides and have our discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. Let me just share my screen. It's a great honor to be here. I thank you so much for having this event. And I thank my fellow panelists and also those of you who are attending. I'm honored by your presence. It'll take just a moment while this slideshow, there we go, goes to its maximum size. So I'm just going to talk for about 10 minutes on some of the main themes of the book. I'll only be touching upon ideas relatively briefly, but hopefully that'll give us a sense of what my argument is, and also what we're trying to do in understanding the use of technology by individuals and small groups. So my goal in Power to the People is to anticipate how terrorists and other non-state actors will use new and emerging technologies to leverage their power during the digital age. The central question of all this research is: how and why have terrorists and other non-state actors chosen new technologies? And what can that tell us about how they'll behave going forward? Now, first, I'd like to make a quick caveat. For centuries, terrorists have mainly used guns and bombs. They'll still mainly use guns and bombs. So that is stipulated. But beyond that, what technological innovations and disruptions should we also anticipate? In the next 10 minutes, I'll cover 3 quick points. The first is about the nature of innovation in our current age, setting the broader context. The second is about the attributes of technologies that terrorists use. And then finally, how political violence is already changing. So first, going to the big picture, I'm going to draw a contrast between open and closed technological revolutions. A closed technological revolution is what we had during the 20th century, with the concentrating of state power and the dawning of the nuclear age. In a closed technological revolution, military and scientific elites can limit access to new technologies like nuclear weapons, satellites, jet fighters, or radar. They're expensive, rare, difficult to build, and protected by things like security classifications and copyrights. So we speak of proliferation of those types of weapons, and we use phrases like dual use, meaning that they have two types of users, civilian and military. And that's the model of military technology that dominated during the last century. Then we opened Pandora's box. In about 1993, the United States shifted from closed technological development to open development. Now, maybe it was inevitable because microelectronics were getting cheaper and DoD, the Department of Defense, couldn't shape that whole market on their own. They couldn't shape it around their own needs. But in any case, what happened is that virtually all of today's major technological changes were driven by publicly financed basic and applied research that happened in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and then they were shared beginning in the 1990s. So there are lots of familiar examples. ARPANET became the internet, tax dollars developed GPS, NASA and the US Air Force drove development of microprocessors, Google built their search engine with funding from a National Science Foundation grant. Virtually all the major components of smartphones come from US government-funded programs, including the microchips, touchscreens, even Siri and Alexa. The US government shared these basic technologies, and what we have now, 30 years later, is the maturing of an open technological revolution. In an open technological revolution, there's popular access to advanced lethal technologies. You don't even have to fully understand them. They're designed to help people experiment. They spread via commercial processes. And so a broader range of people is involved. There are 4 kinds of users: professionals, professional consumers or prosumers, hobbyists, and regular consumers. So it goes way beyond just military and civilian. And they're causing broader societal change. Open technologies are they're affecting patterns of conflict, especially in terrorism, insurgency, insurrections, mass shooting incidents, and other types of individual or small group violence. If you look at the history of warfare, watersheds have resulted from a shift in who can use new weapons and show up to fight, not just from which side has the most technologically advanced means. So in my research, I dug into a couple of historical examples in depth, especially dynamite and Kalashnikov, and also looked at other technologies that did not diffuse. I built several databases starting in the mid-19th century, and I studied how innovation and diffusion to non-state actors happens. I can't go through all that research in this time, but what emerged was a key set of attributes. Terrorists innovate and share disruptive technologies that fit these kinds of attributes. They're accessible, cheap, simple to use. You can read the slide. Basically, the same things that make products sell, make them accessible as well to terrorists, with some exceptions. They're not on the cutting edge. They're usually in the second or third wave of innovation. They tend to be a part of a cluster of other emerging technologies. So there are high technologies and low technologies that can sometimes be combined. And it's very important that they be symbolically resonant. The point is that open technological innovation changes political violence just like it does every other element of our lives. And we can anticipate which technologies are most likely to diffuse. So that brings me to the final question, which is, what technology-driven changes can we anticipate now and in the future? And here I would argue that open innovation and diffusion of technologies is driving changes in global political violence across 3 key dimensions. The first is how people mobilize and radicalize for violence. Second is how they project power or reach. And then third is how they integrate complex systems. So let's begin with mobilization. It's not unusual to use new means of communication to recruit or train people in terrorism. In the 19th century, the anarchists published pamphlets with detailed instruction booklets about how to acquire and use dynamite, how to make dynamite. What's different though today is the scale and scope. Everyone has a powerful computer in their pockets, and there's mass interactivity, robotic replication of messages, live streaming of attacks, high quality first-person filmmaking. For example, Al-Shabaab was the first jihadi group to live tweet an operation in September 2013 in its attack on the Westgate shopping mall in Nairobi, Kenya. And many other groups were watching, and it had an audience of millions. Radicalization is easier and faster. There are lots of estimates, but it used to take people at least 1.5 years, maybe 2 years to be radicalized. Now we're seeing radicalization, for example, through QAnon in a matter of weeks. And there's also greater potential to be individually recruited and groomed. Algorithms help people discover other groups with which they have an affinity. In the US, groups like Patriot Prayer, Proud Boys, Incels, Kenosha Guard, the Boogaloo Movement, and Antifa. And online sites like 4chan, 8kun, Telegram, Reddit, Discord, the list goes on. The Islamic State's use of strategic communications was probably its most important asset. They used it to recruit and attract resources, to justify and legitimize their violence, and to intimidate the civilian population. And then other groups and individuals have copied them. For example, HTS, which is the successor to the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, HTS uses the same Call of Duty motif that ISIS first began to use. Plus, terrorist groups and proxy armies have the means to carry out attacks at a much greater distance now, which leads to the second big trend, and that's open innovation of reach or power projection. This has been developing for a while. People are combining clusters of technologies to create something new, like small UAVs and robotics and 3D printing and nascent autonomy combined together to offer extended reach and a much broader range of possibilities. The Islamic State used fixed-wing small drones and quadcopters for propaganda, reconnaissance, attack management, and to deliver small payloads to hurt civilians and intimidate Iraqis. In 2017, the Ukrainian separatists used small drones to drop thermite grenades on ammunition depots. Larger drones have been used with heavier munitions, as in Syria. And we're seeing simple armed drones used by the Taliban in Afghanistan. For example, they used a weaponized DJI Matrix 210 quadcopter just this past November to attack the governor's compound in Kunduz and killed a large number of his bodyguards. They were playing volleyball. Simple systems can have a huge impact on partners. The argument isn't here that an advanced army like the United States would be threatened by the use of that kind of a quadcopter, but the effect on partners is extraordinary. Counter-drone technology is expensive. Most systems are at least $100,000 or more. Countering drones in large areas costs multiple millions of dollars, and partners can't afford that. They're hard to shoot down. They're small and difficult to spot. More serious military-grade UAVs are being used by 18 or 20 different countries. Many are sold by China, but also Israel and Turkey, which is where Azerbaijan got them in July. They're cheap enough that non-state actors and proxy armies are also easily able to get them, as we've seen with the Houthis in Yemen. Drones are a poor person's air force. Another aspect of reach is facial recognition technology, which is becoming widely accessible to individuals and terrorists to identify targets for killing. I don't have an example of that yet, but it fits all the attributes, and I think we need to very seriously watch this space. And then there's additive manufacturing, or 3D printing, which is not at all a new technology, but it's enhanced by the ability to share online CD, CAD files, online files that you can use in something like Keybase up until last month, an encrypted platform to share. And you may have seen the stories, and you may know about the recent building of a apparently viable assault rifle with 3D printing. Anyway, we're also more vulnerable targets at the same time. The world is saturated with cyber-physical systems and the Internet of Things, and that's a hugely increased attack surface. So how do we handle all that data and technology? And that brings me to the third trend, systems integration and artificial intelligence. Our systems are so complex, fast, data-rich, and complicated that human intelligence has a hard time managing them. So the answer is to build in degrees of autonomy, meaning that the machine can sense the environment, process what's happening, and act without direct human involvement. So simple forms of autonomy and some very limited artificial intelligence are becoming cheaper, more accessible, and more potentially lethal. Jihadists and other terrorists have shown interest in autonomous systems. And remember that in an open technological environment, whatever the United States does soon becomes a demonstration project that is copied. So to sum up, in the 20th century, it required a national army to do all three of those things: mobilization, reach, and systems integration. Now individuals or small groups, including terrorists, can do them all. Terrorists and proxy armies don't have to be able to go toe-to-toe with the United States or any other state army in order to have a huge political impact and change the outcome of a conflict. And explaining how, why, and when that's likely to happen is the point of my book. So thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. I think I'm going to turn to Brian first. Brian, if you could unmute yourself. I'm curious how you see this in terms of the larger arc of how we've seen terrorism. Audrey lays out the argument that things have really changed. And yet, if you look at this from the long scope, we see things changing time and time again, and sort of say, this is the new wave that we have to sort of recreate our counterterrorism framework, strategies, and tactics for. What do you think? And
well, first, thank you. Thank you. What a privilege for me to be here. I should start by apologizing for my late entry. Some of the technological advances that Audrey was talking about haven't reached all of us yet, including me. So I had a bit of a technical challenge this morning. But really, I am a longtime admirer of Audrey's work and found her latest book fascinating. And what I'd like to do is just underscore some of the points she makes, but riff off of some of the other issues. You know, in a going back in time, in a little monograph that I wrote in 1974, I said that owing to technological developments that created both new capabilities and new vulnerabilities, owing to political circumstances and the development of terrorist tactics increasingly as a mode of conflict, that power, and here I mean power defined crudely as simply the capacity to kill, destroy, disrupt, create alarm, was descending into the hands of smaller and smaller groups. Groups whose grievances, real or imaginary, it was not always going to be possible to satisfy. Or to put that another way, that the little gangs of fanatics that have existed throughout history have become an increasingly impotent force to be reckoned with. And how we were going to deal with that in the context of a democratic society and remain a democratic society was one of the major challenges of the late 20th century, and I would add of the early 21st century, as we face continued terrorist threats, both abroad and at home. And now, I would certainly agree with Audrey that the emergence of terrorism in its contemporary form in the late 1960s, early 1970s, reflected a confluence of political circumstances and technological developments. Audrey went back to the 19th century, talked about the invention of dynamite. Certainly we saw the increased availability of explosives in the 20th century. So as she correctly points out, it's not simply the invention, it's the diffusion of these technologies. We also saw in the post-World War II era, the worldwide production and commoditization of ordinary firearms. I mean, it became really, it reflected the spread of machine tool industry that just about every country in the world could make easy to assemble weapons like the AK-47, which he talks about. And AK-47s are made all over the world now. And as I say, they are a commodity. Unlike most commodities, they're not consumed. So we don't burn them up like oil or eat them like soybeans. They can be transferred from war to war, sold, resold, and resold again. I would add one of the technologies that was key in the 60s was international air travel, which terrorists really exploited both as a vulnerability and as a way to increase their mobility. But I think a factor of what was the greatest importance were the developments in modern communications. Television broadcasting, the deployment of communication satellites, portable uplink systems, that made it possible to broadcast video images of the kind of choreographed violence that terrorists were capable of worldwide in real time. And since then, I've often described terrorism as a form of theater aimed at the people watching, and the ability to reach audiences of global proportion certainly enhance the effects of the attacks. Now, again, in the late 1970s, myself, a group of researchers at RAND, looked at the weapons coming into the military arsenals that might be acquired and used by terrorists. What was coming online that we might see in the hands of terrorists tomorrow? Of course, precision-guided weapons, man-portable surface-to-air missiles were of great importance, and there were some events that subsequently occurred, not as many as we anticipated. We missed the most significant technological development. That was the internet, which was then in its infancy. Audrey identifies this, and the internet gave the terrorists an ability to communicate with each other and their audiences worldwide without any intermediation. It made it possible to coordinate truly global terrorist enterprises like Al-Qaeda. It also altered their propaganda, and they were quick to exploit this as they moved from beyond tape cassettes to shaky handheld video cameras to professional studio setups. The Islamic State took that a step further by exploiting social media to communicate even more directly with their audiences. And that opened up a new, in a sense, component of terrorism, especially jihadist terrorism, which simply specialized in creating and distributing content. They operated in a virtual world. They broadcast actual atrocities, along with visual fabrications, like and really quite convincing things, like an explosion in a falling Eiffel Tower, or catastrophes taking place in cities that never took place in real life at all. Now, I would go a step further, and I would say that it also profoundly changed radicalization and recruiting. Audrey mentions this, but I think there's some angles on this that are very interesting. Back in the period of the anarchists and certainly in the groups of the 1970s, when one actually went into terrorism, one joined a clandestine organization. And that organization usually carefully vetted them to avoid infiltrators and unreliable actors. But in the last 10 to 15 years, individuals are radicalized online, and they are recruited remotely without any investment or risk by the recruiting organization. In other words, what we see is recruiting via exhortation. Now, the anarchists did this in the 19th century, but with less effect. But the point is that those who respond are self-selecting volunteers. They're not vetted for reliability. They're not vetted for their capabilities. If they succeed in doing something, they are recognized ex post facto and applauded as members. And that has change the profile, I think, of many of the volunteers who are not so much attracted by the beliefs of the group. And now Audrey points to the fact that people are radicalizing faster. And it is not that they are so quickly radicalized in the sense of devotion to the ideology or belief system or worldviews of the group, but rather it reflects those who radicalize. In other words, they are built-in true believers who are reaching out to an ideology that will reinforce their own anger. Often we see troubled individuals only loosely tethered to the ideology, which for them is really a conveyor of individual discontents. Individuals like Anders Breivik, who was responsible for the Oslo attack, or Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter. And they create a presence on social media to advertise themselves. So a lot of this is about display. Tarrant, of course, broadcasts the actual shooting on real time on Facebook using a GoPro camera. They kill to attract attention to themselves. They're kind of mass murders with manifestos. Now, Audrey and I would agree that what we're seeing is the atomization of terrorist violence. And I think, while some of these things portend the specter of vertical escalation, which of course absolutely obsessed us in the late 20th century, terrorists with weapons of mass destruction. Instead, we've got a kind of horizontal escalation with simply wider participation by self-selecting individuals. Now, there is a downside for terrorists in terms of internet, and that is the internet encourages individual activity. It encourages vicarious participation. And one of the problems that I think the jihadist organizations ran into is that a lot of jihadists could go on the internet, they could boast, they could threaten, they could thump their chest, and then he could turn off the monitor and go out and get a beer. In other words, they were virtual armies that remain virtual. And so that is a weakness. Now, some of these technologies that Audrey describes, I think are still advanced enough that they're going to require state sponsors who will equip them. So we see Houthi rebels with missiles, or Hezbollah with missile systems, more advanced technologies. What I suspect we're going to see down the line is, in a sense, multi-layered phenomenon where we have loosely tethered killers, we have terrorist organizations, we have state-sponsored terrorists, and we have surrogate warfare waged by states. Warfare, because it can be so destructive, open warfare is avoided. Warfare is increasingly becoming a matter of manipulation of perceptions. On terrorism has always been about creating fear and fighting the threat, but it's becoming as much about advertising the individual display as it is advertising the cause. And that really is, I think, the challenge we really confront right now, especially in the United States, as we face both a foreign threat and a domestic threat, as to how these campaigns will unfold. So let me stop there, and we'll talk about it more in the questions.
So two very comprehensive, I like this idea of tying it to the 1970s. You sort of see that long arc, it makes you feel better. Like somehow, we understand the world we're in, even if we're far away from it. Clint, you've written about this. You've written about the use of new technologies for the individual, the group, the nation state, the transnational group. And my real question is, having heard this sort of, I like this term atomization, this idea that, you're self-selected, I want to join up, and then you can do what you want to do and use the weapons you want to use. How do we think about this in terms of our abilities to counter it? And among the things I'd love to hear you discuss is how much of this is, us chasing our tail because technology changes so quickly and we're trying to create these counter strategies. How do you understand the reality of defensiveness here?
Yeah, so Audrey's book is fantastic because it incorporates all the history that I don't know, which Brian, brought up. I read Brian's stuff when I was learning about terrorism as a new agent and, later at the Combating Terrorism Center and stuff. Audrey was able to blend all the history that I don't really know, that I just always read about. But she hit an important junction, which is super useful for me in my work, which we had seen. So I led a team that was tracking ISIS online, and we literally just would log them. We had about 3,500 fighters between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And I was focused on, you could see ISIS split from Al-Qaeda. And when I would go in government spaces, I would say, ISIS is going to break away from Al-Qaeda. And people would say, no way, you don't see what we see. And I would say, I can see them online and they're telling me what they're doing, right? Like it's not hidden, right? And this is that open technology. And this is the era of social mobilization. So that's, Audrey brought up the three components, and that social mobilization is super important. It's also where the Russians saw the power of social media and the internet. So they learned after the Soviet era that the only thing worse than no information is too much information. That if you can't control all of it, you're better to flood the zone. But they also recognized, as Brian was talking about with the ISIS phenomenon, that you could recruit, radicalize, reach out to supporters. And with the Arab Spring, you could bring them all to a place without them knowing what they were there for, why they were doing it, or who was in charge. And so if you're a Russian manipulator, and that's, Audrey brings it to physical mobilization and psychological manipulation, which is where I spend most of my time working now. They saw the Arab Spring as destabilizing and bad, but at the same point, this brilliant coup that had happened in the information space. And so all they did was they took hack and dumps that activists had done before, using information technology as a way to weaken, corporate power. That's the people versus the establishment, right? They're taking back power. They saw what the terrorists had done by mobilizing online, radicalizing, influencing. And then they realized, okay, let's use manipulation. If you look like and you talk like the audience you want to engage, they're likely to believe whatever you say. And they bundled that in together, what I call a disinformation fusion center, most commonly known as a troll farm, right? And so they were able to take all of those elements and sort of put it together and use this technology, which I would remind everybody, all these technologies are usually invented in the West and predominantly by the United States, especially in the information technology field. And then we're somehow torn apart by most of these things that unfold there. And so in Audrey, as Audrey goes on in the book, she talks about Joanne Most and how the principles of organization lead with information warfare really at this point. And I think that is highly indicative of everything we see in today's domestic terrorism scene. Brian talked about the perception management part of it. Mm-hmm. That is 100% what my research teams work on right now, which is the perceived fight. If I could throw a scenario out that's confusing and not necessarily terrorism, but has all the elements, it's Kenosha, Wisconsin, where you saw an entire population, due to the death of someone in a police standoff, a town overrun, right? Quickly, social mobilization unfolded very, very quickly, overwhelmed the police department. And you saw a young man who had a weapon that I carried as an infantry platoon leader 20 years before, and we carried around as a rubber weapon due to safety. He openly has now, everyone has that. He is being filmed on social media in a shootout and a standoff in the streets of Wisconsin. And there's insufficient response and situational awareness by the government, right? The counterterrorism sort of apparatus, the policing apparatus, whatever it might be. And that happens most weeks now in the United States. Somewhere in the United States, we have this unfolding. And so when you look at January 6th is another great example where people's perceptions of what was going to happen that day were vastly different based on how they've been psychologically manipulated by all of these different technologies and by the manipulators behind the scenes who aren't always well known. Stop the Steal was not a fluke. That was a very coordinated, highly planned technological event where sophisticated, well-resourced manipulators teamed up with activist groups, which teamed up with extremist groups. And they all mobilized, they resourced, the list from Julian Mills: recruitment, training, logistics, fundraising. The Wolverine militia did that in Michigan and was going to try and kidnap Governor Whitmer. That was what they were doing. They did that all using technology that's openly available and proliferated. And also at the same point puts law enforcement in the US or military overseas in this weird spot where they have less efficient communication, less situational awareness, lesser weapons to a degree, don't know who their partners are necessarily or coordinate, don't know how to respond very quickly. And so what I find remarkable is like what technologies sort of set off the chain and become highly popular. And we'll watch in some of the domestic groups right now as they debate which extremist platform they should move to now based on the security and encryption availability and whether they think the federal law enforcement are watching. And they'll routinely jump to Russian platforms like VK or Telegram, where there's been lots of Russian infiltration over the years. Not worried about the Russians monitoring, worried about the US government monitoring them, right? It's like this weird, but they're doing that based on how they believe they can maneuver for their cause and what their perceptions are of the security environment. And so perception warfare, as Brian was coming to at the end, perception warfare is everything today. Like it's really like how things are shaped. It is the leading element of it. And that's how you saw white supremacist and militia groups and conspiracy theorists of QAnon and people who are just political enthusiasts all show up on January 6th to storm the Capitol that had no idea who these other groups were or why these guys in body armor and helmets that look exactly like a military unit are storming the stairs. This is all just kind of a confusing morass, at this point. But it does show, as the title says, right, power to the people, how some of these technologies, have moved through and quickly become available. There was one, and I'll probably save it for the Q&A, which is about 3D printing, because that was one that's been a debate for many, many years, right? Like 3D printing will enable extremists. And there's a couple other great books. Peter Zion talks about it in, The Power of the World and how it'll switch. But it hasn't, like, I am super interested in it, but I can't find one that is anything more than making mostly like kids' toys, like things like that. Why hasn't that part taken off, the way that we thought? And is there certain things that are just openly available to such a degree, the cost and trade-offs of like learning this technology aren't there yet and it will happen? That's just one that I find interesting because I think we all in the counterterrorism and then, later security apparatus were very concerned about that part of it. And Audrey brings it up in her book. So it was one that I was very curious about. And I think in conclusion, the discussion about AI really points to how the future, while we're very focused on the populace right now, will be controlled by the most advanced manipulators. And it will either be China or it will be the private sector to a degree. So what I find interesting today is that in the psychological manipulation space, the strongest adversaries are self-funded business people, own media conglomerates, have private military companies. They have access to all these technologies. They can wield all that data. And then there's kind of China on the other side. And then there's a variety of populist sort of groups and different establishments pushing Bitcoin on one end and, 3D printing on another and social media in another sphere. I don't know how that sorts out in the future. So would love to hear, Audrey's thoughts as we kind of get into the discussion on that. But fantastic book. It's going to be an awesome textbook, by the way, for anyone who's running a terrorism class.
Audrey, do you want to respond to some of this and also kind of weigh in? There are a number of questions that have come up and some of them sort of are asked, I'm collecting them here, but the question of, is this really about violence or this is about psychological manipulation, and where are the intersection between the two, or how do you see that?
Well, the answer to that is the answer that both Brian and Clint pointed to, which is that violence is the result of psychological manipulation right now. So I don't think you can distinguish between those two. Sometimes there's psychological manipulation without violence, but oftentimes there is violence. And some of the people who end up either part of a group that's violent or engaging themselves in violence are not necessarily interested in the cause. They're just being manipulated to believe that what they're doing is the right thing to do. So I don't think there's a way to distinguish those two. I would like to point to the broader picture, which I think both Brian and Clint have laid out, but just to put it in a slightly different frame, because this is something I'm very worried about. And that is how do democracies find that middle road between authoritarian states that are able to use these technologies in order to use surveillance on their own people? And, the extreme cases, the Uyghurs in China. And then on the other hand, this mess that Clint has laid out well, that is more about disorder and about, use of force in ways that are unpredictable, that undermines democratic institutions in ways that are quite alarming, as we saw on January 6th. So how does a democracy find that middle path? I think this is the big question for all of us beyond terrorism. It's about what is the future of governance among democracies in the 21st century, given the fact that you can have tremendous violence that is as anarchical, or, use your own word, that is as disorderly as I think it's becoming. And with the tools that are available to engage in these kinds of separate purposes and activities on the disorderly side. So how do we find that middle road? And I have a lot of ideas about how to do that, but no one person is going to be able to come up with this answer. This is a matter of doing a lot of what your center does, Karen, looking at legal solutions, regulatory solutions, but also self-restraint, trying to understand how to put restraint within the development phase of a new technology. I actually think technology is part of the answer to many of the technologies that I was talking about, but not all of them. We have to have a tremendous amount more research and work on this area, not just with respect to terrorism, but with respect to what is the role of the new 21st century open technologies when it comes to the future of democracy.
Brian, do you want to weigh in a little bit here about, it sounds like we start with a conversation about terrorism, which has, as it becomes, in your word, atomized, becomes a term that's just so broad. At some point, we're going to have to find ways of distinctions about it. To Audrey's bigger point, which is that terrorism and the threat and the uses of these technologies by terrorists are really a window onto the vulnerabilities we face as a society from terrorists, yes, but also from our kind of addiction to technology and to the proliferation and accessibility of this technology. So I know you've thought about this. In terms of Audrey's question, she didn't say this, but I'm going to word it for her, like, where do we begin? Where do we begin to address this? Yes, unmute yourself.
Look, as Audrey was talking, where does this go? And I was having, since I was trained as a classical historian, I was thinking, well, one of the terrible endpoints would be, replication of the 12th century BC, in which really the advent of a new form of warfare, as the major Bronze Age kingdoms became addicted to advanced technology chariot warfare, along came really more loosely organized light infantry. And within a period of less than half of a century, all of the Bronze Age kingdoms fell. The dark scenario would be, we don't have an answer, it falls apart, and then somehow it's put back together in some new form. But I think the real challenge we face here, and you've alluded to this in terms of our laws and how we go after some of these things, how do we, our primary purpose is going to be to contain or control terrorist violence. So our law is going to focus on the violence portion of what we face. And right now, my context is the domestic threats that we face. We don't have yet a strategy or a good set of answers to deal with some of the things that Clint was talking about, and Audrey has pointed out, not just the control of the technology, but how do we go after the manipulators, the hidden funders, those abilities. So yes, we can pass new legislation that, which I'm quite wary of, and that is, the domestic counterterrorism legislation, because Congress has to be seen doing something, and so we'll legislate an end to this. That is not going to get at this. That's not going to get at either some of the technological controls we may need on technology. And in some of these things, we're going to be actually redefining the rules. How do we, let me take Audrey's question or you're re-asking. How do we, in a society that respects freedom of speech and protects freedom of speech, how do we have to redefine what we mean by incitement? Incitement demands a pretty clear link between a person's specific speech and a subsequent specific action. But when we're dealing with an atomized situation in which we have lots of incitement, we have repeated messages over time, we have messages that appear to come from other people, but really come from a central thing, and that leads to a set of actions. Do we have a way of looking at incitement in different ways? Do we have ways of controlling some of these technologies like social media? So we don't yet. We honestly don't have a strategy. And
one of the questions sort of follows along this, and I'm going to go to Clint for this because it's such a fraught question. So don't.
Thank you.
You're welcome. How can the concept of manipulation and disinformation be used against the perpetrators and those they recruit? Which in a way, gets at Brian's issue is the message the weapon or part of the weapon, right? So just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, so what I find interesting in most contexts so far, when I've spoke either to regulators or I work with the social media companies sometimes, or I work with the government sometimes, is they are in a strictly defensive posture, and that won't work. So their way is to try and cut people's speech down or control what they can say, or to try and remove or increase the barriers to the technology to be used. This falls on its face with, like Audrey mentioned in her book, live streaming video, right? The Christchurch attack, those sorts of things. You can't have live streaming and police. It's just, even the AI is never going to catch up with it because you can always innovate a new way around it. So interestingly enough, in terms of disruption, they're still trying to police content without policing actors. So that is another sort of problem in this entire spectrum. So my teams are highly focused on attribution of actors because you can't influence and hide. That's one part of the problem. The second part is exactly what Brian brought up about incitement. If you take, I love in the book, there's Anwar al-Awlaki. And so every time I think about what Anwar al-Awlaki said, if I took out Anwar al-Awlaki and Al-Qaeda and I just went out on the internet, I can find a whole lot of what Anwar al-Awlaki said on the internet today. It's all over. You could find elected officials even saying things that are in parallel, almost match, what Anwar al-Awlaki was saying. And so then that gets to, okay, what is your actor set and what can you do about it? So you can try and delineate what incitement is, or you can mobilize the population back against those that are advocating incitement, which we don't really do. So in perception warfare, like if you're looking at this, our mode has always been just let them keep bombing us and then try and take them out so they're not bombing us. There has to be an offensive part. People tend to believe that which they see first and that which they see most, which means you need to counter quickly and in volume. Our strategy for everything is honestly to send an old white guy out at a podium to talk back to Anwar al-Awlaki. That was the whole counterterrorism era, right? It's like, well, jihadists are watching that, right? The target audiences are watching that. That is the analog solution, right? Which was state-to-state power. The Russian model understands that. They're brilliant at it. It's party to party. It's people to people. It's NGOs to affiliations. It's issue areas to this. and it's thousands of messengers, spread out. ISIS was thousands of messengers. They're in 24 different languages, putting out social media content. So we can do that too, but our democratic structures are not authorized to do it. They're not used to doing it, and they're resistant just from inertia from actually breaking out of that. I could go right now and find hundreds of videos of military people, for example, filming amazing things they're doing in the military on their personal social media accounts. We could do that since we are paying for them to be in the military and film themselves, right? There are innovative solutions where you could change the volume of content that's out there in different spaces. But there's great hesitancy to do that. I think a lot of that's the backlash to the Global Engagement Center, some of those mechanisms that we tried to put into place. And I'm hoping that in the future, the younger generation, even the AOC era, right, has already taken that at the political level. I'm hoping that will unfold in the institutions that are around them as well.
Kind of following up on that, there's a question. Do you believe that the easy access to rapid communication on the internet will make radical ideologies more durable? I'm thinking of QAnon, which seems to rapidly adapt to counter any challenge and draws its adherents further in. And I guess the follow-up question to that is, and Audrey, you kind of skirt around the edges of this in your book, which is that how do we anticipate what's coming down the line in terms of the uses of these technologies? And I'm curious all of your answers to this. Is there a way to anticipate how these groups, what they're going to latch on to, how these groups are going to talk, and maybe counter it ahead of time in sort of the face-to-face or online to online that Clint was talking about? And let's start with you, Audrey, and then just see what else comes up.
Well, there are a couple of things that I think are sort of general points that are relevant. The first one is that the pandemic is a particular situation. And so the fact that you have a lot of people who are constantly on their computers, many of them are not the usual, the types of people that we would normally expect to be radicalized. So for example, among those who've been radicalized by QAnon, there's a tremendously large proportion of women, which is not the case with most of the other groups that we've watched in the past. And it makes QAnon somewhat unusual. And I think personally that the very first step to try to make things better is to get through the pandemic. Maybe that's just the stultifyingly obvious, but we have a particularly fraught situation that we're in right now, where people are really afraid and they're looking for some kind of agency, some kind of reassurance, and some kind of ballast, and they're looking for it in the wrong places. So getting through the pandemic and having a more normal life where people can get out and actually have a more balanced psychology is going to help. But then, I would also like to say that there are some things that come out of the 19th century. Since we're talking about history, Brian, I want to go to more recent history, but, regulation and also self-restraint, regulation of dynamite. Nobel made an enormous amount of money in the UK. And one of the reasons why he was very enthusiastic about building regulations within the UK was that things kept blowing up and they kept reflecting huge, badly, terribly on the Nobel industries. And a lot of people, innocent people, were being killed because the movement of dynamite, first nitroglycerin, then dynamite, was being carried along on, carts on rocky roads, and then it would blow up and it would kill all the people in a small town in Wales, for example. And so everybody was against dynamite. So Nobel really wanted to make money. He wanted to work through the UK to all of its colonies. And so he worked with the UK government to try to put in place regulations that he wanted that would help him actually be able to sell more dynamite within the British Isles and within the broader colonial empire. So it's not necessarily the case that private companies are at odds, and neither is necessarily innovation at odds completely with smart regulation. Now, I'm skeptical, just like you are, Brian, about whether we're at a point where we can draw up smart regulation yet, but I think we can start somewhere. And for things like the Internet of Things and appliances, I think having a regulation that says that what you bought should keep working if it's disconnected from the internet. For example, if you buy a refrigerator that's connected, it has a IoT connection, I think it should still work as a refrigerator if it's disconnected from the internet. So that's a pretty easy regulation. You should be able to get what you paid for in terms of a working doorbell on your house. It should still work even if it's disconnected, or the lock that people use in a smart house. I mean, this sounds like it's really small, but I actually believe we can start with small things and then build up to have a better suite of practical solutions. Anyway, I could go on with a lot more, but that's the kind of thing that I think we need to start doing.
Brian, here's a question that comes to you from your last comments. Should modern counterterrorism operations try to manage public expectations and reaction or overreaction to an event? In other words, you can't reinvent the FBI every time an event occurs or punish the enemy disproportionately. And I guess the idea is basically, how much do we react to an event, a new technology, or try to have a larger framework that anticipates what's coming down the pike? How do we manage the expectations of these things?
Yeah, I mean, look, one thing that being around for a long time has told me is to really lower my own expectations about what I think we can do. And no, I agree that we can do some things with regard to controls. I think we can do some things in the area of anticipating some of these new technologies. I'm still, however, conscious that, what happens are events and things happen. And then that begins to have, the pandemic happens, that changes things. Then something else happens, before that, a 9/11 happens, that changes things. Events, we're going to be events driven. So what does that mean in terms of, in terms of strategy? Are we going to really be able to fundamentally change American society? Probably not, at least not in any way that government control, nor should it be in that business. I don't see government in patrolling ideologies. In terms of a counterterrorism strategy, look, let's be realistic about what we can do with laws and counterterrorism. We are not going to strip mine every seam of bigotry out of American society. These have been continuing dark currents in our history. They've lasted for more than a century, in some cases a couple of centuries. We are not going to be able to go into a person's soul and change how they think. Maybe there's some future technology that will do that. Right now, we're not going to do that. Are there going to be? I think ultimately this comes down to, and it sounds so trite, but it's so real. It comes down to our own commitment to our own values. It comes down to our own courage. It comes down to our own stoicism, our own sense of community, comity, words like this. It comes down to basic commitments to truth. I mean, our founding fathers used, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, there are basic things that you do, and then you try to desperately hold on to those and contain the most salient threat against those. Beyond that, I think I'm pretty limited in what I can say about what we can achieve.
Clint, I have a question for you. You were surprised about the lack of 3D technology to create the kind of weaponry that Audrey talks about, actually. This brings the larger question of how much is this really about sophisticated technology, and how much is it about unsophisticated technology that sort of just is what's allowing this to be atomizing? Can you whatever that word, can you sort of distinguish between this in terms of when you're really looking at a fear? We're not, like Brian referred to before, talking about, and Audrey in her book, about nuclear weapons. This is a very different thing. Can you talk about how that functions in your mind in terms of, do we have time to research this to address it, and just the strategic response generally?
Yeah, so 3D technology is interesting to me because it's been a decade of discussion about when will terrorists use 3D technology to make weapons, right? And they have done it and they can do it, but I think it also comes down to the openly available access of many other weapons, right? To a degree, like you can still acquire tons of other technologies openly and very easily, depending on what group you are. So it's interesting, like as a brand new FBI agent, we would get calls for precursor materials for bomb making. I don't know that you get that same call for a lot of the domestic extremist groups today, right? Like there's some differences around how we treat it in terms of regulation and signals and those sorts of things. The other ones that I find interesting, like today, so for perception warfare, what I was trying to allude to earlier, that perception warfare, either as the message or the messenger, is a lot about digital identity. Social media has created a phenomenon where people want messengers that look like them and talk like them. It's extremely important. So this is where AI comes into play hugely, and the Chinese are already doing it. They're creating synthetic presenters that look like and talk like different variants of an audience that they're trying to reach. That is next level if you can do that, but also openly available. For example, if I were an extremist and I wanted to reach an audience anywhere, I would buy a new phone, I would log into that social media app, whatever it is, I would create an account with that location and with the hashtags and a stolen picture of somebody from that audience, and I would just hit follow 50 times. And the AI will deliver to me exactly what I should make a messenger of that I either recruit or synthetically create. And that will be far more engaging on scale, right? Yeah. At one level, if I've got $100, I can also buy a subscription to a digital analytics firm and just get all of it. So it's interesting, you know, like after when I would testify, they'd be like, how did the Russians figure out how to infiltrate African Americans, you know, on the political left, and then all the way to conservative white Americans on the political right? And I was like, they got a subscription and they did it, right? It wasn't, there was no secret sauce. These things are openly available at that information technology level to understand that perception warfare, whether you're an extremist, harder to do, but you could still do it. Or if you're a next level psychological manipulator, and if you got some resources, you can do it very, very quickly and in a dominating fashion. I wish the military, the US government realized they have that capability too. In fact, they invest in it. As Audrey talked about in their book, we don't want to be prying into people's privacy and things like that. But we also are the ones that are investing the most in these technologies. We shouldn't let them be used to defeat us, you know, in a certain way. I think there's a balance that can be struck on all these things. We'd love to hear from Audrey's perspective because she discusses a lot of those things in her recommendations.
So Audrey, we are almost out of time. So respond to Clint and then I'll wrap it up.
Well, Clint is absolutely right. A lot of the book is about how we should take control. We should grasp the strengths and weaknesses and particularly understand the risks of the very technologies that we have helped to create. I mean, as I pointed out in my opening talk, many of these technologies come out of basic government funded, in fact, most of them, basic government funded research. So we should be the best at using them. And instead, we're allowing them to manipulate us. And I'm not saying that things like, you know, a terrorist going into a large, you know, store and shooting it up, that's not going to go away. But what's new now is that you've got the ability to live stream what that person is doing. And then you've got millions of other people who are watching it. And because we have a very well-established phenomenon that was first looked at in the 1970s with aircraft hijackings, and Brian knows this much better than I do, contagion is very clearly indicated when it comes to the use of terrorist violence. So it's not just a matter of the lethal technologies, it's also a matter of the communications technologies, because there's always a combination between those two. There's always a new lethal technology or numerous lethal technologies and a communications vector. And I don't think we're getting a handle on either one, but the communications vector requires those people who are in communications to engage in some kind of you know, standards and self-regulation as much as anything else, because it is true that we believe in freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. So this is, as it was at the beginning of the 20th century, partly a responsibility of our press.
You know, well, okay, that's can be our next seminar. I think it's interesting what sort of where you all came down to talking about democracy, which I think is sort of a fascinating takeaway and actually a good one. And the other thing you all referred to was the immense importance of research and the way in which history, but also research and current research and how we need to invest in that. So from my point of view, that is also a very important takeaway. It sort of justifies everything all of us are doing. So we're going to wrap it up here. I just want to remind our listeners, thank you for all of your questions. I know I got to some of them and I, collapsed some of them into one another. I just want to tell you, next week, listen to my podcast, Vital Interest Podcast with Nick Rasmussen, former NCTC director. And next week we have a seminar like this coming up on with the Middle East Institute and Combating Terrorism Center on recrudescence, assessing today's and tomorrow's terrorism threat on March 4th. So with that, I want to say goodbye. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Brian. And I can't wait till next time. And thank you, audience.
Thank you.